It was supposed to be just another night on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The audience was buzzing, the band was warming up, and the cameras were rolling with their usual electricity. But no one in the studio, not a single person, knew that this episode would soon become one of the most emotional moments in the show's entire history. Backstage, a woman sat quietly in the guest area. She was a beloved actress once, talented, bright, and adored by millions. But life had hit her harder than anyone could see from the outside. A painful divorce, career setbacks, public criticism, and months of silent battles had drained her completely. Tonight, she wasn't just nervous, she was breaking inside. Her hands trembled as the stage manager signaled her turn. She took a deep breath, forced a smile, and walked onto the stage as the audience applauded warmly. Johnny Carson stood to greet her with his trademark charm, unaware of the emotional storm she was carrying. At first, she tried her best to keep it together. She laughed softly, answered a few light questions, and even managed a joke. But Johnny noticed something was off. Her smile was tight, her eyes glossy, and her voice too soft to hide the pain. A moment later, she paused mid-sentence. The audience fell into a quiet hush. Johnny leaned forward slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. That question, simple, sincere, caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in months. Not really. Not with kindness. Not with patience. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes shimmered. She looked down, hoping to blink away the tears, but they were already forming. Something inside her cracked. The studio became painfully silent. Even the band, even the camera operators felt the shift in the air. Johnny realized instantly that this wasn't stage fright. This wasn't nerves. This was a woman who had carried too much for too long, and she had finally reached her breaking point. Right here, under the lights, in front of millions. The audience watched breathlessly, because what Johnny Carson did next, no one saw coming. It was supposed to be just another night on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The audience was buzzing, the band was warming up, and the cameras were rolling with their usual electricity. But no one in the studio, not a single person, knew that this episode would soon become one of the most emotional moments in the show's entire history. Backstage, a woman sat quietly in the guest area. She was a beloved actress once, talented, bright, and adored by millions. But life had hit her harder than anyone could see from the outside. A painful divorce, career setbacks, public criticism, and months of silent battles had drained her completely. Tonight, she wasn't just nervous, she was breaking inside. Her hands trembled as the stage manager signaled her turn. She took a deep breath, forced a smile, and walked onto the stage as the audience applauded warmly. Johnny Carson stood to greet her with his trademark charm, unaware of the emotional storm she was carrying. At first, she tried her best to keep it together. She laughed softly, answered a few light questions, and even managed a joke. But Johnny noticed something was off. Her smile was tight, her eyes glossy, and her voice too soft to hide the pain. A moment later, she paused mid-sentence. The audience fell into a quiet hush. Johnny leaned forward slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. That question, simple, sincere, caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in months. Not really. Not with kindness. Not with patience. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes shimmered. She looked down, hoping to blink away the tears, but they were already forming. Something inside her cracked. The studio became painfully silent. Even the band, even the camera operators felt the shift in the air. Johnny realized instantly that this wasn't stage fright. This wasn't nerves. This was a woman who had carried too much for too long, and she had finally reached her breaking point. Right here, under the lights, in front of millions. The audience watched breathlessly, because what Johnny Carson did next, no one saw coming. Which city or country are you watching this emotional story from right now? Make sure to comment. For several long seconds, Johnny Carson didn't speak. He simply allowed her the space to breathe, to gather herself, to exist without pressure. It was something she hadn't been given in a very long time. The audience watched with silent concern as she tried to steady her shaking hands. The stage lights reflected off the tears on her cheeks, turning them into tiny glimmers of vulnerability. Her mascara smudged slightly, her voice trembled, and yet she still tried, desperately, to maintain composure. Johnny gave her a soft, reassuring smile. "If you want to talk," he said gently, "we're here. If you don't, that's okay too." His words broke the final wall she was trying to hold up. She inhaled deeply, and with that breath came the release of months, maybe years, of buried pain. "I've been falling apart," she whispered. The room fell so silent that you could hear the faint hum of the studio lights. She continued, voice cracking. "I can't sleep. I can't eat. I feel like the world is moving on without me. Like I'm not enough anymore." Her confession was raw, unfiltered. This wasn't the glamorous actress the world knew. This was the woman behind the fame. The one who cried alone at night, who doubted herself, who felt abandoned by the very industry that once celebrated her. Johnny leaned forward slowly. His eyes carried no judgment, only empathy. "What made you feel this way?" he asked softly. She swallowed hard. "It started with the divorce," she said. "The tabloids tore me apart. People online said awful things. Then I lost a role I cared about. Then another. And every time I tried to get back up, something else knocked me down." Her voice trembled. "I started believing them. Believing that I was broken." A few people in the audience wiped their eyes. And then, right in the middle of this emotional unraveling, she whispered something that nearly shattered the room. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Johnny exhaled sharply, as if her pain physically hit him. "You're human," he said quietly. "That's who you are." She let out a small, painful laugh that was half sob. "I wish it felt that simple." Before Johnny could respond, she placed a hand over her face and began to cry openly, no longer able to hold anything back. Her shoulders shook as she tried to catch her breath. The audience stared, frozen in empathy. Some had seen celebrities cry before, but this was different. This wasn't drama. This wasn't publicity. This was a woman finally collapsing after holding up the world alone. Johnny didn't fill the silence. He didn't force her to move on. He simply waited, patient, steady, present. A minute passed. Then two. Slowly, she lowered her hand from her face, revealing eyes swollen with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to fall apart on your show." Johnny gently shook his head. "You're not falling apart," he replied. "You're letting yourself be seen. And that takes courage." The audience murmured softly, moved by his words. She looked at him, tears still clinging to her lashes. "Do you really think so?" she whispered. Johnny smiled. "I know so." For a moment, she simply looked at him, the way someone looks at a lifeline after nearly drowning. And then she took another deep breath. "You know," she said slowly, "I think I always felt like I had to be strong. Even when I was hurting. Even when I needed help." Johnny nodded. "A lot of people feel that way." Her voice softened. "But today, sitting here, I realize how exhausted I am from pretending." Her vulnerability was so raw, so real, that the entire room felt like it was holding her hands, lifting her up, telling her she wasn't alone. Johnny gently tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking, "Have you ever seen someone break down right in front of your eyes? If you were in Johnny's place, what would you have done? Comment below, your voice matters." The story continues. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to steady herself. "I'm terrified," she confessed. "Terrified that people will see this and think I'm weak." Johnny paused. Then he leaned in, voice deep, firm, and gentle all at once. "If they think you're weak," he said, "then they don't understand strength at all." She blinked, stunned by the sincerity in his words. The audience whispered in agreement. Some nodded. Others wiped their faces. It was becoming clear that this wasn't an interview anymore. This was healing. This was human connection unfolding live. This was Johnny Carson making a choice that would soon change the direction of the entire show and the course of her life. Because at this moment, Johnny didn't care about ratings. He didn't care about schedules. He didn't care about the producers waving from behind the cameras. He cared about her, and everyone watching could feel it. What he would do next, no one in the studio was prepared for. The studio felt like it was floating in a strange mix of silence and electricity, every eye fixed on the trembling woman sitting across from Johnny Carson. She had never seemed so small, so fragile, and yet somehow so brave. Her confession had peeled away the persona people knew from the screen. What remained was the real woman behind the fame, the one who rarely stepped into the light. Johnny watched her with a softness few had ever seen from him. The audience had seen him calm nervous guests before, but this moment felt different. He wasn't trying to steer the interview. He wasn't trying to save the segment. He was trying to save her. Just then, a quiet murmur began somewhere in the middle rows of the crowd. A man in his 40s leaned closer to his wife, whispering discreetly, "Isn't that her? The actress from Silver Dawn." His wife squinted, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh my God, you're right. That is her." And just like that, recognition rippled through the audience in a quiet wave. People started leaning in, eyebrows raising, hands covering mouths. "That's her from the awards show. She hasn't been on TV in months. She disappeared after the divorce. Is she okay?" Whispers spread like wildfire. For months, tabloids had speculated about her absence. Fans wondered why she suddenly vanished from screens after being one of the brightest stars of her era. Some blamed substance issues. Some blamed ego. Some blamed scandal. But none of them ever considered the truth. She was hurting. She was human. She was breaking. Tonight, all those rumors shattered. Johnny sensed the shift. His eyes flicked across the audience. He could see it in their faces, pieces falling into place, empathy rising like a tide. He leaned slightly closer to her and spoke lower, as if shielding her from the suddenly overwhelming recognition. "You don't have to explain anything you're not ready to share," he murmured. "We're not here to judge you. We're here to listen." She looked up through swollen eyes, stunned by his kindness. But before she could answer, a woman in the front row gasped audibly. "I knew it was her." "Oh, honey," she whispered, tears filling her own eyes. The actress heard it. Her shoulders tightened. She realized suddenly, painfully, that people knew. Not the glamorous version of her. Not the polished, poised version. Not the smiling red carpet version. This version. The broken one. The vulnerable one. She looked down at her trembling hands. "Oh no," she whispered shakily. "They know who I am." Johnny leaned forward, gently placing his hand over hers on the desk. The audience saw it, felt it, and went completely silent again. "Let them know," Johnny said softly. "Let them see you. Not the character. Not the headlines. You." Her breath caught. "No one wants to see this side of me." Johnny shook his head. "You're wrong," he said firmly, not harshly, but with conviction. "People need to see that you're human. Because too many forget that." She looked at him, tears pooling again. Meanwhile, the recognition in the audience intensified. A group of young fans in the back clutched their hands together, whispering her name like a prayer. "That's really her. I grew up watching her. I wish she knew how much she meant to us." Johnny saw their faces and made a decision that would change the energy of the entire room. He turned his body, slowly, deliberately, toward the audience. "I don't want anyone in this room," he said calmly, "to look at her with judgment or curiosity. If you're going to look at her, look with kindness." The room froze. The weight of his words settled like a warm blanket across the studio. Some audience members lowered their eyes in respect. Others nodded, touched by his sincerity. Johnny looked back at her. "You're among people who care," he said. "Not people who want a scandal. Not people who want something from you." She blinked, stunned. "No one's ever said that to me," she whispered. "Not in years." Johnny's voice softened even more. "Then tonight is the night someone does." Her lips trembled. She placed a hand on her chest, trying to contain the flood of emotions. And then something unexpected happened. A woman in the third row stood up, placing her hand gently over her heart. "We love you," she said softly. Another voice joined in. "You're not alone." Then another. "You're safe here." The actress covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Johnny smiled, a warm, fatherly smile, and said quietly, "You see? You matter, more than you think." The atmosphere changed completely. This was no longer an interview. This was an audience embracing a wounded soul. This was a healing circle disguised as a television show. This was the moment the world saw her, not the star, but the woman. And Johnny Carson had just taken the first step toward standing up for her in a way no one ever had. What he would do next would leave everyone in tears. The studio air felt different now, thicker, warmer, almost sacred. The audience wasn't just watching a show anymore. They were witnessing a soul being held together by the gentleness of strangers and the unwavering presence of Johnny Carson. The actress wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers. "I didn't expect this," she whispered. "Any of this." Johnny gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Life rarely gives us what we expect, but sometimes it gives us what we need." She let out a shaky breath, nodding. But beneath her fragile calm, something darker churned. Years of pressure, pain, and exhaustion pressing at the edges. Johnny noticed it. He had seen countless guests hide behind jokes, charm, or rehearsed lines. But this was a woman who had been silently drowning long before she stepped into the studio. He leaned forward, voice low. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded hesitantly. "When was the last time someone asked you how you were, and actually wanted to hear the truth?" Her eyes widened, then lowered, then filled again with tears. I don't remember," she whispered. "Everyone wants something from me. A smile, a performance, a headline. But no one," her voice cracked. "No one asks about me." Johnny nodded slowly, painfully. "That's the cost of fame sometimes. People forget you're a person." She inhaled sharply, as though someone had finally spoken the words she was too afraid to admit. "I feel so used," she said softly. "So disposable." That struck something in the audience. A few gasped. Others exchanged heartbroken looks. Johnny placed both hands flat on the desk, calming, grounding. "You're not disposable," he said firmly. "And if anyone made you feel that way, they were wrong." She looked at him, devastated and touched at the same time. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered. Johnny leaned back, eyes steady and warm. "Because you deserve kindness," he said. "And because I won't sit here and let the world tear you down any further." Her breath caught in her throat. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged frantic looks. This was no longer the show they planned. But Johnny Carson wasn't asking permission. One producer signaled to the stage manager, "We need to move on. Cut to commercial." Johnny saw the commotion and shook his head sharply. "No," he said aloud, without breaking eye contact with her. "We're not cutting away." The audience gasped softly. The producers froze. Johnny wasn't just comforting her now. He was taking a stand. "Johnny," she whispered, startled by his sudden resolve. He turned to the cameras, breaking the script entirely. "You know, folks," Johnny began, "we invite guests here to entertain you, to make you laugh, to talk about their projects." A pause. A long, heavy pause. "But somewhere along the way, we forget that behind the movies, the songs, the fame, there's a human being." The audience leaned in. Every word fell like a gentle hammer, breaking illusions, building truth. He gestured toward her. "This woman has spent years giving herself to the world, performing, smiling, pretending everything was perfect. And tonight, she didn't give us a performance." He looked directly into the lens. "She gave us honesty." The crowd erupted into soft applause, gentle, heartfelt, supportive. The actress pressed a hand against her chest, overwhelmed by the unexpected waves of compassion. Johnny turned back to her. "You don't owe anyone perfection," he said softly. "You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that isn't real." Tears streamed down her face again. But this time, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of release. Johnny continued, "You've carried more pain than anyone knew. You held it in because you thought the world wanted you to be strong. But strength isn't pretending you're not hurting. Strength is exactly what you're doing now." She covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. The audience waited, silent, supportive. Johnny's voice softened. "You know what I think?" She looked at him through her tears. "I think the people watching this, right now, all across America, they're not seeing a broken woman. They're seeing a brave one." Her breath hitched, and her shoulders shook. Johnny placed a hand gently over hers again, steady, warm, anchoring. "And as long as you're on my stage," he said, "I won't let anyone tear you down. Not the tabloids, not the critics, not the rumors." A stunned silence filled the room. Then, a man in the audience whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Bless her heart." Another woman said softly. She needed this. Someone finally needed to say all that. Johnny leaned even closer to the actress. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever again, if you don't want to be." Her tears kept falling, but her breathing steadied. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt seen. Not as a product, not as a celebrity, not as a paycheck, but as a human being. And Johnny Carson had just publicly stood up for her in front of millions. What he would do next would leave the entire world speechless. For a long, breathless second, the studio was silent. Johnny Carson, usually a man who could flip any moment into a joke, twist any emotion into laughter, stood frozen. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because, for the first time in a very long time, he felt something break inside him too. The audience watched him carefully. The crew stayed still behind their cameras. And Sandra, the woman whose entire soul had cracked open under the pressure of the world, kept her hands pressed together as if she were afraid that if she let go, she would fall apart completely. Johnny took one slow step toward her. Just one. But that single step felt like he was crossing a canyon. Then, with a voice so soft it barely reached the mic, he said, "Sandra, before anything else, I want you to breathe." It wasn't the witty Johnny Carson. It wasn't the polished host. It wasn't the man America watched to escape their worries. This was Johnny the human being. And that's exactly who she needed. Sandra inhaled, trembling, uneven, like her lungs had forgotten how to work. The audience didn't breathe at all. Some wiped tears. Some looked stunned. But every single person felt the weight of that tiny, fragile breath. Johnny nodded gently, as if her breath was the bravest thing anyone had done on his stage in years. Then he said something no one expected. "You don't owe us strength. Not tonight. Not ever." Sandra's eyes filled again. A few women in the front row silently cried. Even the camera operator sniffed and quickly wiped his face. Johnny moved closer and sat beside her, not behind a desk, not from across the stage, but right there, next to her. A Tonight Show first. He rested his hand lightly over hers. Not pulling, not pushing, just being there. And then he did something that left the audience speechless. He told his own truth. "People think this job makes you bulletproof," he began, voice low but steady. "They think because we smile on camera, we don't carry anything heavy. But grief, pain, heartbreak, they don't care who you are." Sandra stared at him like she couldn't believe the most famous man on television was sitting with her, supporting her, seeing her. Johnny continued, "I want you to know something, Sandra. You are not a burden. You are not weak. You are a person who has survived things that would break most of us." The audience erupted into applause, but not the loud, comedic kind. This was the soft, trembling applause of people who had been through battles of their own. People who understood. Sandra covered her mouth with both hands and cried, not the silent, ashamed tears of earlier, but the kind that release years of suffocation. And right when everyone thought the moment had reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A woman in the audience stood up. She raised her hand and said, voice trembling, "Sandra, I went through the same thing, and I'm still standing. You will too." Then another person stood, and another, and another. In less than 30 seconds, over half the audience was on their feet, each person raising a hand in solidarity. Some had tears, some had shaky smiles, but every one of them was saying, "You're not alone." Sandra gasped when she saw them. She had spent years believing she was invisible, drowning in silence. Yet here she was, surrounded by hundreds of strangers standing up for her without hesitation. Johnny watched them all rise, his expression softening into something deeper than any on-air moment he'd ever had. "This," he murmured quietly into the mic, "is what people deserve. Not judgment, not pressure, just kindness." Then he looked directly into the camera, straight into the homes of millions watching live. A lot of you sitting at home, you're carrying things too, more than you admit. Maybe tonight, let this moment remind you, you matter. And you're not as alone as you think. Even through the TV screens across America, it felt like Johnny was speaking to every broken heart individually. Sandra wiped her face, her voice nearly gone. "I never thought anyone would stand for me." Johnny squeezed her hand gently. "Then tonight, let this be the first time. And not the last." The music didn't play. The cameras didn't cut away. The crew didn't interrupt. Because everyone knew. This wasn't entertainment. This was healing. And it was happening live. Sandra looked out at the audience, those strangers who had turned into her unexpected army, and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice shook, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was gratitude. Real, raw, overwhelming gratitude. Johnny leaned in and added softly, "Sandra, tonight you didn't break. You opened. And sometimes that's what saves us." The audience stood again, this time in a full standing ovation. Long, powerful, emotional. And Sandra, the woman who had walked onto that stage alone, broken, ashamed, walked off with her head higher than it had been in years. Because one man stood up for her. And then hundreds followed. And then millions felt it from their homes. A moment that was supposed to last 2 minutes ended up changing everyone who witnessed it. The standing ovation finally faded. But the feeling in the room didn't. Sandra had already left the stage. guided gently by two crew members, still wiping tears, but with a softness in her expression that wasn't there before. She looked lighter, braver, almost like she had been carrying a suitcase full of bricks for years, and tonight, she finally set it down. But what happened after the cameras cut? That's the part almost no one knows. The audience had taken their seats again, still emotional, still stunned by what they had just been a part of. You could feel it in the air, like a quiet electricity. Nobody talked. Nobody rustled. It was as if they all collectively understood. They had witnessed a moment that was bigger than television. Johnny Carson sat at his desk, but he didn't shuffle his cards. He didn't fix his tie. He didn't smile for the next segment. Instead, he looked down at the desk like he was trying to collect himself. The man who made America laugh every night suddenly needed a minute, simply to breathe. Ed McMahon leaned closer and whispered, "Johnny, you good?" Johnny nodded slowly. But Ed could see it. He wasn't okay. Not entirely. A moment like that changes even the strongest hearts. And then something surprising happened. A young stagehand, barely in his 20s, nervous, clearly new, approached Johnny quietly during the break. He held a small note in his hand, his fingers shaking. "Mr. Carson, sir? Someone in the audience asked me to give you this." Johnny unfolded the paper. For simple words were written in a woman's handwriting. "You saved her tonight." Johnny stared at the note longer than anyone expected. Longer than he stared at any cue card that entire year. Because deep down, he knew it was true. When the cameras came back on, he looked into them with a softness no script could fake. He didn't crack a joke. He didn't make light of the moment. He didn't pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen." The audience nodded, many still wiping tears. "It costs nothing," Johnny continued, "but it can change a life." Tonight, we got reminded of that. And then, just for a fraction of a second, Johnny's voice broke. Just enough for millions watching at home to feel it. But he recovered, smiled gently, and carried the show forward. It wasn't the usual Tonight Show energy. It wasn't the fast-paced comedy. It was something better, something real. After the show ended, Johnny didn't leave immediately like he normally did. He walked backstage, searching, until he found Sandra in a quiet corner of the green room, sitting with a cup of water clutched in her hands like it was an anchor. She stood when she saw him. "Johnny, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." He held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't apologize for needing help. Ever." Sandra's eyes welled again, but this time with strength, not shame. Johnny went on. "You didn't break the show. You reminded it why it exists. To reach people. To connect. To give them something human." Sandra let out a breath she didn't even know she was holding. And then Johnny said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "If tonight brought you even one step closer to healing, then every minute was worth it." Sandra covered her heart with her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." Johnny smiled, a small, quiet, genuine smile. "Sometimes," he said, "people just need someone to look at them and say, 'I understand.'" And that was the moment Sandra finally believed. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't too broken. She wasn't alone. And the world had just watched her rise again.